Imagine taking a bite of an ordinary piece of bread and noticing something strange. The longer you chew, the sweeter it begins to taste. There is no sugar sprinkled on top, no honey, no frosting, and no syrup hiding inside. Yet the flavor changes in your mouth. That simple experience reveals an important fact about carbohydrates that many people never learn. A food does not have to taste sweet to eventually contribute glucose to your bloodstream. Starch can be broken down into smaller carbohydrate molecules during digestion, and your body is remarkably efficient at doing exactly that. So instead of asking only, does this food contain sugar? A more useful question is, what happens to this food after I eat it? That question takes us into a much bigger conversation about carbohydrates, blood sugar, insulin, appetite, body composition, and long-term metabolic health. And once you understand that difference, the idea of a safe carbohydrate becomes much easier to understand. For years, carbohydrates have been treated as though they are one enormous category. Bread is a carbohydrate, rice is a carbohydrate, potatoes are carbohydrates, fruit contains carbohydrates, beans contain carbohydrates, even broccoli contains carbohydrates. Technically, those statements are true, but nutritionally they are not nearly specific enough. Two foods can both contain carbohydrates while producing very different effects in the body. One may deliver a concentrated amount of digestible carbohydrate with relatively little fiber, while another may contain mostly water, fiber, vitamins, minerals, and plant compounds with a much smaller amount of rapidly available carbohydrate. Putting both foods under the same label doesn't tell you how quickly they are digested, how much glucose becomes available, how filling the food is, or what happens to your blood sugar afterward. The important distinction isn't simply whether a food is a carbohydrate. It is the form of that carbohydrate, the amount you eat, how processed it is, how much fiber it contains, and what the rest of your meal looks like. A simple way to understand the subject is to separate carbohydrates into sugars, starches, and fiber. Sugars are relatively simple carbohydrates that can be absorbed more directly. Starches are made from long chains of glucose molecules linked together, which means the digestive system has to break those chains apart before the resulting glucose can be absorbed. Fiber behaves differently. Much of the fiber found in plant foods resist digestion in the small intestine. Some forms continue into the colon, where microorganisms in the gut can ferment them and produce compounds known as short-chain fatty acids. So even though all three belong to the broad carbohydrate family, they do not behave identically inside the body. That difference is one of the most important things to understand if you are trying to improve blood sugar control or overall metabolic health. Go back to that piece of bread for a moment. When you chew it long enough, the changing taste gives you a small demonstration of digestion. Enzymes in saliva begin acting on starch and help break it into smaller carbohydrate molecules, including maltose. The longer the food remains in your mouth, the more opportunity those enzymes have to work. Your digestive system continues the process after you swallow. The point isn't that bread suddenly becomes table sugar inside your mouth. The point is that starch doesn't need to taste sweet to eventually provide glucose that your body can absorb. This is why looking only at whether a food tastes sweet can give you a misleading picture of its carbohydrate content. A bland food can still contain a substantial amount of digestible starch. Once glucose enters the bloodstream, the body has to manage it. The pancreas releases insulin, a hormone that helps regulate blood glucose and assists tissues in taking up and storing energy. Skeletal muscle is particularly important because it can take up glucose and store some of it as glycogen for later use. When insulin sensitivity is good, the body can generally handle carbohydrate efficiently. But when tissues become less responsive to insulin, the process becomes more difficult. This reduced responsiveness is commonly called insulin resistance, and it is associated with a range of metabolic problems, including elevated blood glucose, increased abdominal fat, abnormal blood lipids, fatty liver disease, and a higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes. This is why the same carbohydrate-containing meal can affect different people in different ways. Your metabolic condition matters just as much as the food itself. That is also why statements such as carbohydrates are bad or carbohydrates are healthy are too broad to be useful. Consider two people eating a similar amount of rice or bread. One person may have good insulin sensitivity, regular physical activity, substantial muscle mass, adequate sleep, and an overall nutrient-dense diet. Another person may be sedentary, sleep poorly, carry significant visceral fat, and consume highly processed foods throughout the day. Their bodies are not operating under the same conditions. Genetics, age, body composition, physical activity, sleep, medications, overall calorie intake, liver health, and many other factors can influence metabolic responses. The carbohydrate is part of the picture, but it isn't the entire picture. One tool that helps explain differences between carbohydrate foods is the glycemic index. It estimates how quickly a carbohydrate-containing food raises blood glucose compared with a reference food. Foods with a higher glycemic index generally produce a faster increase in blood glucose, while lower glycemic foods tend to produce a slower response. But the glycemic index has an important limitation. It does not tell you how much carbohydrate you actually consumed. Portion size matters. A food can have a relatively high glycemic index, but be eaten in a small quantity. Another food can have a lower index, but be consumed in a very large portion. Fiber, processing, cooking method, the presence of protein and fat, and the combination of foods in a meal can all influence the actual glucose response. So glycemic index can provide useful information, but it should never be treated as a complete nutritional score. Processing is another major part of the story. Imagine an intact grain, and then imagine that same grain being ground into a fine flour. The original grain has a physical structure that can slow the access of digestive enzymes to its starch. Grinding and milling break down that structure and can make the carbohydrate easier and faster to digest. Further processing can change the food even more. This is one reason a minimally processed whole grain food should not automatically be considered metabolically identical to a refined flour product made from the same original plant. The ingredients may have started in the same place, but the structure of the final food can be dramatically different. The same idea applies to starchy foods such as potatoes and rice. Their effects can vary depending on the type of food, the way it is prepared, the cooking process, whether it is cooled and reheated, the portion size, and what else is eaten at the same meal. That doesn't mean potatoes are dangerous or that rice needs to disappear from everyone's diet. It means that the word starch doesn't tell you everything you need to know. A whole food prepared simply and eaten in a reasonable portion can fit into many healthy diets. The larger issue is how much concentrated carbohydrate you are consuming, how processed it is, and whether the overall meal provides enough fiber, protein, and other nutrients to make it satisfying and balanced. Now compare those concentrated starches with non-starchy vegetables such as broccoli, spinach, cauliflower, cabbage, zucchini, cucumber, leafy greens, peppers, asparagus, and mushrooms. These foods still contain carbohydrates, but a large portion of their weight and volume comes from water and fiber rather than concentrated digestible starch. That makes a major difference. You can generally eat a substantial serving of many non-starchy vegetables without consuming the same amount of digestible carbohydrate found in a similar sized portion of bread, pasta, rice, or another concentrated starch. At the same time, these vegetables provide vitamins, minerals, fiber, and a wide range of plant compounds. They aren't miracle foods, but they are remarkably efficient foods from a nutritional standpoint. This is why if someone uses the word safe to mean a carbohydrate that is nutrient-dense, fiber-rich, relatively low in digestible carbohydrate, and generally less likely to create a large glucose load when eaten as part of a balanced meal, non-starchy vegetables are among the strongest choices. The important point is not that they contain zero carbohydrate. They don't. The advantage comes from the combination of low energy density, high water content, fiber, micronutrients, and plant compounds. They can occupy a large portion of the plate while contributing relatively little rapidly available carbohydrate compared with refined grains or concentrated starches. Fiber itself deserves much more attention. It is not simply a substance that passes through the digestive system without doing anything. Certain fibers reach the colon, where gut microorganisms ferment them and produce short-chain fatty acids, such as acetate, propionate, and butyrate. These compounds interact with the intestinal environment and may influence several aspects of human physiology, including metabolic processes, immune activity, and appetite regulation. Some types of dietary fiber can also influence signaling pathways involved in satiety and hormones such as GLP-1, but that should not be exaggerated. Eating vegetables does not produce the same effect as taking a prescription GLP-1 medication, and food should not be presented as a replacement for medical treatment. The important lesson is simply that whole plant foods interact with the body in ways that go far beyond the number of calories printed on a label. Vegetables also provide minerals that the body needs for normal function. Potassium plays important roles in nerve signaling, muscle contraction, and fluid balance. Magnesium is involved in hundreds of biochemical reactions, including processes connected with energy metabolism and glucose regulation. A diet rich in a variety of whole foods can therefore provide much more than a simple source of carbohydrate. It supplies a broad mixture of nutrients that work together. This is another reason why comparing foods only by their carbohydrate grams can miss a large part of the nutritional picture. But food isn't the only factor influencing how your body handles carbohydrates. Your muscles matter enormously. Skeletal muscle is one of the body's major sites for storing and using glucose. Every time you walk, climb stairs, cycle, garden, swim, or perform resistance training, your muscles need energy. Regular physical activity can improve insulin sensitivity and increase the ability of muscle tissue to take up glucose. You don't need to become an athlete to benefit. Even ordinary movement matters because your muscles are metabolically active tissue, not simply structures that help you move from one place to another. The opposite is also important. When movement disappears from daily life, insulin sensitivity can decline. This doesn't mean that sitting on the couch for a few days automatically causes diabetes, but it demonstrates how responsive metabolism is to physical activity. Your body is constantly adjusting to what you do. If muscles are regularly being used, they have a greater need for energy and glucose. If you spend most of the day inactive, that demand is lower. This is one reason physical activity should be considered part of metabolic health rather than something separate from nutrition. It also explains why two people can appear to eat similar diets and still experience different outcomes. You may know someone who eats bread, rice, pasta, or dessert regularly and remains metabolically healthy. You may also know someone who gains weight easily or develops elevated blood sugar despite believing they eat a similar diet. That difference doesn't necessarily mean one person has discovered a special carbohydrate that works for them. Genetics, age, activity level, sleep, medications, body composition, liver health, calorie intake, muscle mass, and insulin sensitivity can all contribute. The human body doesn't respond to food in isolation. It responds to the entire environment in which that food is consumed. Sleep is one part of that environment that is often ignored. Metabolism does not shut off when you go to bed. Poor or insufficient sleep can affect insulin sensitivity, appetite regulation, stress hormones, and food choices. When people are exhausted, they may crave highly palatable foods, have less motivation to exercise, and find it harder to maintain consistent eating habits. That means someone trying to improve metabolic health can spend all day counting carbohydrates while overlooking one of the most basic recovery processes the body needs. Good nutrition is important, but so is giving the body enough opportunity to recover. Stress can influence the picture as well. Short-term stress is a normal biological response. Hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline help the body respond to immediate challenges. The problem is prolonged stress combined with poor sleep, inactivity, and unhealthy eating patterns. Chronic stress can affect appetite, sleep quality, physical activity, and glucose regulation. That does not mean stress alone causes insulin resistance. Metabolic health is far too complicated for one explanation, but it does reinforce the idea that you cannot understand blood sugar by looking at one ingredient on a plate while ignoring everything happening around it. Body composition also matters, particularly visceral fat. This is the fat stored around internal organs in the abdomen, and it is metabolically active. Higher levels of visceral fat are associated with insulin resistance and other cardiometabolic risk factors. As the body's metabolic environment becomes less favorable, glucose and lipid regulation can become more difficult. That is one reason simply banning a single food category may not solve the underlying problem. If insulin resistance is already present, meaningful improvement may require attention to physical activity, body composition, sleep, overall diet quality, and energy balance rather than focusing on one ingredient. Fructose adds another layer because not all sources of fructose are nutritionally equivalent. Fructose occurs naturally in fruit, where it is packaged with water, fiber, vitamins, minerals, and other plant compounds. That is very different from consuming large quantities of added sugars in sweetened beverages and highly processed foods. The liver plays a central role in processing fructose. An excessive intake of added sugars can contribute to excessive calorie consumption and metabolic problems, especially when those sugars are consumed in liquid form. But this does not mean an apple should be treated like a sugary soda. The food matrix matters. Think about the difference between eating an apple and drinking a sweetened beverage. An apple requires chewing, it contains water and fiber, it takes up space in your stomach, and usually takes longer to consume. A sugary drink can deliver a significant amount of sugar rapidly without providing the same physical structure or fiber. Both may contain simple sugars, but the way they are consumed and the nutritional context are completely different. That is why looking only at the word sugar can be misleading. Whole foods and highly processed products can contain similar types of carbohydrate while producing very different eating experiences. Food structure is therefore one of the most useful concepts to understand. Imagine starting with an intact plant food. Then it gets chopped, cooked, ground, milled, refined, and eventually combined with oils, sweeteners, flavorings, and other ingredients to create a highly processed product. Each stage can change how quickly the food is eaten, how easily digestive enzymes can reach the carbohydrate, how filling the food feels, and how much energy can be consumed before the person feels satisfied. Processing does not automatically make a food unhealthy, and whole food does not automatically make a food perfect. But when the goal is metabolic health, foods that retain more of their natural structure and fiber often make it easier to build a satisfying diet without relying heavily on rapidly available carbohydrates. So what carbohydrate should you choose if your goal is better blood sugar control? There is no single magical food that protects everyone from insulin resistance. There is no vegetable that cancels out an otherwise unhealthy diet. And there is no universal carbohydrate rule that works for every person. But if you are looking for a category of carbohydrate-containing foods that is generally rich in fiber, micronutrients, water, and plant compounds, while being relatively low in digestible carbohydrate, non-starchy vegetables are an excellent foundation. Leafy greens, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, zucchini, peppers, asparagus, mushrooms, and similar vegetables can form a large part of a balanced meal without creating the same carbohydrate load as a plate dominated by refined starch. The reason is simple. Their value comes from what they contain and what they don't contain in large concentrations. They provide substantial volume without a large amount of rapidly available carbohydrate. They bring fiber and micronutrients. They can make a meal more filling, and they can be combined with protein and healthy sources of fat to create a meal that is much more satisfying than a meal built primarily around refined carbohydrates. Imagine two plates. The first is dominated by white bread, refined pasta, or another concentrated starch, with only a small amount of vegetables on the side. The second plate is mostly non-starchy vegetables, accompanied by a source of protein and a reasonable portion of a minimally processed carbohydrate if desired. Those meals are not metabolically identical. The second plate generally provides more volume and fiber while reducing the proportion of rapidly available carbohydrate. That doesn't mean the first meal is forbidden. It simply illustrates why the composition of the entire meal matters more than the word carbohydrate printed on a nutrition label. This is also why you do not necessarily have to eliminate bread, potatoes, rice, or other starchy foods forever. Some people can include them comfortably as part of a balanced diet. Others, particularly people with diabetes or significant insulin resistance, may need more individualized carbohydrate guidance. Activity level matters too. A person who exercises heavily may have very different carbohydrate requirements from someone who is sedentary. Medical conditions and medications can also change the picture. If you have diabetes or another metabolic condition, your own healthcare professional or registered dietitian can help determine the carbohydrate pattern that fits your situation. Instead of asking whether a food is a carb, ask better questions. How processed is it? How much fiber does it contain? How much digestible carbohydrate is in the portion? How quickly do you normally eat it? What foods are you eating alongside it? Does the meal contain adequate protein? Are you physically active? How does your own blood glucose respond? And what nutritional value does the food provide beyond its carbohydrate content? Those questions give you much more useful information than a simple good food versus bad food list. If you are worried about insulin resistance or diabetes, don't try to diagnose the problem based on how you feel after a single meal. Talk with a qualified healthcare professional about appropriate testing. Measurements such as fasting glucose and HbA1c are commonly used to assess glucose regulation, while additional tests may be appropriate in certain circumstances. Results need to be interpreted within the context of your health history and other findings. One number rarely tells the entire metabolic story. And if the goal is to improve insulin sensitivity, don't make the mistake of thinking food is the only lever available. Physical activity can make a meaningful difference. Walking after meals can increase glucose use by working muscles. Resistance training can help maintain and build muscle. Regular aerobic activity supports cardiovascular and metabolic health. Adequate sleep matters. Managing excess body fat can matter. Not smoking matters. Keeping blood pressure and cholesterol under control matters. These factors interact with one another, which is why metabolic health improves most effectively when several parts of the lifestyle move in the same direction. The encouraging part is that you don't have to change everything overnight. If your diet has been dominated by highly processed foods for years, you don't need to become perfect tomorrow morning. Start with the easiest changes. Add vegetables to meals. Choose fiber-rich foods more often. Keep nutritious foods available when you're hungry. Replace sugary beverages with water or unsweetened options when appropriate. Walk more frequently. Add strength-building activity if it is safe for you. Work toward more consistent sleep. Gradually reduce the foods that allow you to consume large amounts of refined carbohydrate without feeling satisfied. The goal is not punishment. The goal is to create an environment in which better choices become easier to repeat. There is another mistake people make when reading nutrition labels. They focus almost entirely on the sugar line. A food can contain little or no added sugar and still provide a substantial amount of digestible starch. A refined flour product may not taste sweet, but its starch can still be broken down into glucose during digestion. This is exactly why the bread experiment matters. The sweetness that appears after prolonged chewing is a simple reminder that carbohydrate chemistry is not determined by taste alone. Your digestive system is perfectly capable of transforming starch into smaller carbohydrate molecules that your body can absorb. Once you understand that, grocery shopping becomes a little different. Instead of grabbing a product because the front of the package says low sugar, look at the whole nutritional picture. Is the product highly refined? How much fiber does it contain? How much total carbohydrate is present? What ingredients make up most of the product? Does it contain substantial added sugar? Does it leave you satisfied after eating? Or does it make you want another serving shortly afterward? These questions help you evaluate the food rather than simply reacting to a marketing claim. And then there are the foods that don't require complicated calculations. A bowl of leafy greens, steamed broccoli, roasted cauliflower, cabbage, zucchini, mushrooms, peppers, asparagus, green beans. These foods may not look exciting compared with the latest diet product promising perfect blood sugar, but their nutritional advantages are straightforward. They provide fiber, water, vitamins, minerals, and plant compounds while generally contributing relatively little rapidly available carbohydrate. They are not magic, they are simply useful. That is the real reason non-starchy vegetables stand out. Not because they can cure diabetes, not because they make every other food irrelevant, and not because carbohydrates are inherently dangerous. They stand out because they allow you to build a large, satisfying, nutrient-dense meal without making concentrated starch or added sugar the center of that meal. When you combine those vegetables with an appropriate source of protein and other nutritious foods, you create a meal that supports a broader approach to metabolic health. Once you understand that distinction, the carbohydrate debate becomes much less confusing. You don't need to fear every carbohydrate, and you don't need to assume every carbohydrate is harmless. There is a major difference between added sugar, refined starch, whole food carbohydrate, and fiber-rich plant foods. There is also a major difference between eating one food by itself and eating it as part of a balanced meal. The human body responds to the entire combination. Every meal sends signals through your digestive and metabolic systems. A meal dominated by refined carbohydrates can produce a very different response from one built around vegetables, protein, healthy fats, and a moderate portion of minimally processed carbohydrate. One meal isn't going to determine your health, but eating patterns repeated for months and years can influence body weight, insulin sensitivity, blood lipids, and overall metabolic risk. That is why the goal should not be finding one perfect food. The goal should be building a pattern you can actually maintain. So if you're trying to improve your metabolic health, don't start with fear. Start with understanding. The next time you see the word carbohydrate, remember that it doesn't tell you enough by itself. Ask what kind of carbohydrate the food contains. Ask how much of it is digestible. Look at the fiber. Consider how processed the food is. Think about portion size. Look at what else is on the plate. And consider your own activity level and health situation. These details matter far more than a simplistic list of foods labeled good or bad. The safest carbohydrate then isn't necessarily the food with the lowest number on the nutrition label. It is often the carbohydrate that comes naturally packaged inside a nutrient-dense food, alongside fiber, water, vitamins, minerals, and other useful compounds. That's why non-starchy vegetables deserve such an important place on the plate. They don't need a dramatic health claim to be valuable. Their strength is in their basic composition, lots of nutrition and volume, with relatively little rapidly available carbohydrate. And once you understand that, you can stop looking at carbohydrates as one giant enemy or one giant category of healthy foods. You can start judging them by their structure, their nutritional value, their level of processing, their portion size, and the way they fit into your overall lifestyle. A piece of bread doesn't need to be treated like a spoonful of sugar, and a bowl of vegetables doesn't need to be treated like a miracle cure. The truth is more useful than either extreme. Your next meal doesn't need to be perfect. You don't need to eliminate everything you enjoy. You don't need to follow the most extreme diet you find online. A better starting point is to make your meals a little less dependent unrefined starch, a little richer in fiber, and a little closer to whole foods. Add more vegetables. Choose minimally processed carbohydrates when they fit your needs. Include adequate protein. Stay active. Sleep consistently. And if you have diabetes, prediabetes, or another medical condition affecting your metabolism, work with a qualified healthcare professional rather than trying to manage the condition through internet advice alone. Because the real lesson from that piece of bread isn't that bread is bad. It's that your body can transform food in ways that aren't obvious from taste alone. A bland food can eventually provide glucose. A carbohydrate can arrive wrapped in fiber or stripped of it. A whole food can behave differently from a refined version of the same original ingredient. And your body's response depends not only on what you eat, but also on how much you eat, how active you are, how well you sleep, your body composition, and the metabolic state you bring to the meal. Once you see carbohydrates that way, the question changes completely. You stop asking which foods contain carbs and start asking which carbohydrate foods give me the most nutritional value for the amount of digestible carbohydrate they provide. You stop chasing labels and start looking at food structure. You stop searching for one magical ingredient and start building a healthier overall pattern. And that may be the most useful answer of all. There isn't one carbohydrate that can guarantee perfect blood sugar. There isn't one vegetable that can erase years of unhealthy habits. But there are choices that consistently make it easier to build a nutrient-dense diet. Non-starchy vegetables are one of the strongest foundations because they provide volume, fiber, micronutrients, and plant compounds without delivering the concentrated carbohydrate load found in many refined foods. So the next time you sit down to eat, don't ask whether the food is simply a carb. Ask what comes with that carbohydrate. Is there fiber? Is the food intact or heavily processed? How large is the portion? What else are you eating with it? And does the meal help you feel satisfied while providing the nutrients your body needs? Those questions are much more powerful than fear. Because metabolic health isn't built by one perfect meal. It is built by the choices you repeat.